Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
A row has broken out after a 4-year-old boy with suspected pneumonia was forced to sleep for hours on the floor in A&E. When a journalist tried to show a picture of the boy at the hospital in Leeds to the Prime Minister, Mr Johnson initially refused to look at it and then took the journalist's phone and put it in his pocket. As other party leaders accused the PM of just not caring, the Health Secretary Matt Hancock was dispatched to the hospital where he apologised for the boy's experience, but he was jeered by onlookers as he left. Our political editor Laura Koonsberg has the latest.
Not long left to roll. Boris Johnson wants to win and hopes he can do so by taking territory that's been Labour forever, but where the majority voted Leave.
People in this part of the country, people across this country, spoke and said that they wanted to leave the EU. Now is the moment for us to get on and do it.
Beyond that familiar mantra, though, is he really in tune with millions of people who rely on public services and worry about them?
Do you want to take this country forward?
Like 4-year-old Jack Willamant Barr's parents, whose son was pictured on the front page of the Mirror newspaper today after having to wait on the floor in a Leeds hospital for hours.
You've taken my phone, put it in your pocket, Prime Minister. His mother says the NHS is in crisis. What's your response to that?
I'm sorry. It's a terrible, terrible...
Boris Johnson awkward when an ITV reporter asked him to respond directly to the photograph. Although he was flanked by a former Labour MP today, this is not safe ground for Boris Johnson, not at all.
Why were fake websites set up? And
there were tricky questions from the audience on the Tories' behaviour online, Brexit and the TV licence fee. It certainly wasn't his home crowd.
do you really think, after nearly a decade of a very significant squeeze on public spending, that you as a party understand the concerns of people in the north of England? Especially since today you struggled to look at a picture of a 4-year-old boy on the floor of an emergency department in a hospital in Leeds.
Well, I'm very proud of what we are doing to rebuild Leeds General Infirmary, and it's one of the hospitals that we will rebuild from the beginning. It will be a fantastic project, and we are putting, as I say, the biggest ever investment into our NHS.
Boris Johnson's here trying to get Tory people to vote Tory in this part of the country. Do you think that's going to happen?
I hope not. Right. We've had 9 years of awfulness.
But others are for turning.
We'll change into Tory.
How will you vote this time?
For Tory. Just to keep Jezza out.
At this late stage, though, today Labour was given a big chance in front of a big crowd in Bristol to push on the bruise.
The Daily Mirror today shows this picture of a 4-year-old boy suffering from pneumonia being treated on the floor of a hospital. And
all the way through, they've attacked the Tories on how they've dealt with the health service.
The Tories have had 9 years to fund our NHS properly. It's time to bring their regime to an end and elect a Labour government that's determined to fund our NHS properly.
The Health Secretary was dispatched to Leeds General to try to calm things down.
It's not good enough, and I've apologised. I've got 3 small children myself. I've spent too many evenings in A&E, and I know what it feels like.
The Health Secretary, though, was harangued by a small group of Labour protesters on his way out. The two sides in this election are miles apart. With only 3 days to go, tensions are on the rise. And in the last few minutes, the mother of the boy, the centre of all of this, has written to the press regulator asking for her son not to be turned into the subject of political argument. But I'm afraid with only 3 days to go left in this campaign, that is exactly what has happened. All of the political parties piling in here, all of the opposition trying to put pressure on Boris Johnson, suggesting that his reaction to all of this suggests somehow he doesn't have empathy, he doesn't really care about the health service. Now, of course, the Conservatives would push back on that, saying that they are raising money going into the health service, but they have certainly spent today on the back foot, trying to cope with a row that they had found themselves in when they are so close to the finish line, the opposite of the kind of day that Boris Johnson would have chosen to have.
Laura, thank you.
With just 3 days to go, Boris Johnson embarked on a tour of marginal seats hoping that his pro-Brexit message will bring over former Labour supporters who voted to leave the EU. But instead, it was a photo of a sick 4-year-old boy having to sleep on the floor of a Leeds hospital that dominated today's campaigning. Boris Johnson tried to avoid looking at the picture when confronted with it by a reporter, but finally admitted it was, quote, terrible. The Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn said the episode showed the Prime Minister just didn't care. Our political editor Gary Gibbon has this report.
Boris Johnson campaigning in Grimsby first thing this morning. It was billed by Tories as part of a blitz of Labour heartlands. But when you're trying to reassure voters in seats like this that you do care about the NHS, it isn't a good look to refuse to engage with a story about a 4-year-old photographed as he was forced to lie on coats on the floor in a hospital A&E unit.
And that's why we're putting £34 billion in.
This is a 4-year-old boy, Prime Minister, suspected of pneumonia, forced to lie on the floor on a pile of coats.
I understand. And obviously we have every possible sympathy for everybody who has a bad experience in the NHS.
How do you feel looking at that photo?
Of course. And let me tell you that I haven't had a chance to look at it.
Why don't look at it now, Prime Minister?
I'll study it.
Look at it now. This is Jack Williman.
If you don't mind, I'll give you an interview now. What we are doing is we are taking this country forward. I have every sympathy with families.
You refuse to look at the photo. You've taken my phone, put it in your pocket, Prime Minister. His mother says the NHS is in crisis. What's your response to that?
I'm sorry, look. It's a terrible, terrible photo, and I apologise obviously to the families and all those who have terrible experiences in the NHS. But what we are doing is supporting the NHS, and on the whole, I think patients in the NHS have a much better experience than this poor kid has had.
Did his team panic this could make some new converts cool on Boris Johnson? Whatever the cause, not much later, Boris Johnson was hinting at a massively distracting new policy. It could mean no one pays a TV licence fee.
You have to ask yourself whether that kind of approach to funding a TV, a media organisation, still makes sense in the long term, given the way other organisations manage to fund themselves. That's all I will say.
I'll turn it round so everyone can see it. This picture of a 4-year-old boy suffering from pneumonia being treated on the floor of a hospital.
Jeremy Corbyn was in Bristol, bringing the focus back onto the hospital A&E story and hoping this moment does make some voters think twice about defecting to the Tories. Starting his day in Grimsby, Boris Johnson was at one end of what's been called the red wall of Labour heartland seats, stretching from the North Sea to North Wales. Many of these are critical to Boris Johnson winning a majority. They include Bolsover in North Derbyshire.
Part of me thinks, like, I agree with Boris and stuff, like, I just want Brexit over because it's boring me now. Just like, we all voted, get on with it.
So you're a bit tempted by Boris Johnson's offer?
That side of it, but then the rest of it,
You're not sure you trust him on, what, the NHS and public services?
Yeah, I think the NHS for me is a big one.
I'm not sure that I trust him. NHS for sale and all that kind of stuff. So it's one of them.
You trust Boris Johnson on Brexit maybe, but not on the other stuff?
Yes, that's the problem. He's got half of my heart, but not the other half.
One polling analysis today suggests the Tories might be winning here, but Labour could be closing in behind them. And though some of Boris Johnson's new recruits are happy with their choice, some are deeply conflicted. You've deserted Labour as well this time?
Yeah, and I felt sick doing it.
Really?
Yeah.
You voted Tory?
Yeah.
Would you ever call yourself a Tory?
No. No.
You cast your postal vote the moment you got it?
Yes.
Couldn't wait?
Yeah, done. Nothing that anybody would say would sway me.
Do you want this seat to change?
I think it's time.
My beliefs are Labour, but I voted for Brexit, and Labour don't know what they're doing with Brexit. So
and that's pushed you into the arms of Boris Johnson?
Well, yeah, plus the other things, I think I trust him on the NHS. I trust on what he's saying. He will deliver. I really do. And I like the guy because he's quirky.
We found many voters here still agonising over their choice and dreading decision day on Thursday. Exactly the sort of voters Tory HQ wouldn't want focusing on an interview where Boris Johnson doesn't want to look at an image of the struggles of the NHS.
Gary Gibbon. And here is a full list of the candidates standing in the Bolsover constituency. The Health Service has moved to the very centre of the election campaign, and tonight an investigation by Channel 4 News shows that dozens of trusts have in the past few months reported to their boards that they are facing severe levels of risk, which could affect patient safety and could be catastrophic. Our health and social care correspondent Victoria MacDonald has this report.
A shocking photo of 4-year-old Jack Willamette Barr with suspected pneumonia lying on an A&E floor. An image few will forget.
Great.
And today, the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, was scrambled at the last minute to Leeds General Infirmary to deal with this.
I feel terrible for anybody who has to go through that.
Do you apologise to the
Yes,
family?
of course. And to anybody who gets service from the NHS that isn't up to the standard that they should expect.
All the main political parties are promising more money for England's NHS, but it's needed now. Already delays in treatment and staff shortages are at record levels. And now a Channel 4 News investigation shows just how stark the risks are to patient care.
Today we've run out of beds in the hospital, so at the moment there are patients waiting long periods of time for a bed into the hospital, and because there is now no room in the A&E department, ambulances start queuing out of the front door.
This senior doctor had just come off shift on Saturday when we spoke to her, anonymously, because she was worried about reprisals from her trust.
Most departments are probably working in situations which are unsafe on a fairly regular basis. My concern is that it's impacting on patient care. If you don't have enough staff to see and treat patients in a timely manner, then you're not going to notice deterioration. Things will happen later, perhaps drugs given later than they are meant to be. At times they can provide good care, but there are also times when they can't provide okay care. It is substandard care, and that adds to their stress because they know that.
Today, the Royal College of Emergency Medicine said that in the first week of December, over 5,000 patients waited for longer than 12 hours in the emergency departments of 50 trusts and boards across the UK. The challenges are not just in A&E, although that is where it's most visible. Channel 4 News has examined what is happening in England's NHS by looking at how trust boards rate their own risks. So this is the Health Service, in its own words. The latest board papers available from 92 acute NHS trusts show that 65 had at least one risk where they said it was likely to happen and would have a severe impact. They give this the highest scores of between 20 and 25. And 14 of those trusts showed the maximum, that is 25 out of 25, meaning potentially catastrophic results. The most common themes: funding, staff shortages, waiting times for cancer, fire safety, and old hospital buildings becoming dangerous. As an example, Queen's Hospital, part of Barking and Havering Trust, they listed a number of severe risks. What's happening here isn't isolated. You can see that from our research. So when we looked at their latest board papers, we could see they'd set the highest risk, that's 25, for things like capital funding, building works. For their deficit, they're running at a loss. They've even said that they can't find a way to make savings while maintaining quality of care. In other words, if they are to maintain patient safety, something has to give. But looking elsewhere, Nuneaton, the trust gives the maximum risk rating for
patient flow within urgent care not being managed effectively due to a lack of adequate processes and systems, resulting in potential for delayed treatment and patient harm.
In Leicester, a major risk of
failure to deliver key performance standards for emergency, planned and cancer care.
And there's a significant risk at Wirral Hospital Trust of a
catastrophic failure in standards of safety and care.
Barking, Havering and Redbridge Trust told us that they have now secured a £9 million capital funding loan from the government, and they do want to make sustainable savings, but that this takes time. And all the trusts we've mentioned here say they have plans to address and mitigate the risks we identified. And some say those risks are the potential worst-case scenario.
I think what we're seeing with these board papers and these really high risk ratings is that it demonstrates the level of pressure that NHS trusts are under at the moment. So they're really facing workforce pressures, so a shortage of staff illness. They're facing demand pressures, so many more people coming through the door. And they're also facing the imminent Brexit issue. So that's looming, and whenever a trust is assessing risk, that's going to be high up there.
Jack is home now, but he spent 4.5 hours waiting in A&E last Tuesday, then 5 hours on a trolley before finally getting a bed. His mother posting this picture in despair.
Well, our political correspondent Liz Bates has followed Jeremy Corbyn to Bristol today, and she's due to hear from Boris Johnson in Gloucestershire shortly. So Liz, what's been happening?
Yes, so we're expecting Boris Johnson here in Gloucestershire for a campaign visit this evening, but it's been a difficult day for the Prime Minister on the campaign trail after this morning he was confronted with a picture of a young boy being treated on the floor of a hospital because he was unable to get to bed. It was Mr Johnson's reaction to that picture that sparked criticism, and it was seized on by the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn at a campaign rally in Bristol, where he held up to the crowds a front page of a newspaper with a picture of that young boy on it. Now, the reason that this could be significant is because these unscripted, unchoreographed moments, we haven't had many yet in this campaign, but they really can turn the tide if they cut through with the public. Of course, we don't know yet what impact this will have, but the reason that it really could be damaging is because it gets to the heart of a question that's been posed many times to Boris Johnson, which is the NHS safe in his hands? Now, as a voter watching the day's events, you may not have been reassured today on that issue. Now, we've seen from the Conservative Party in reaction to this lots of sort of rushing around, trying to limit the damage, including from the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, who has apologised today to the family. The long-term impact of this on the general election result, we don't know yet, but we will know in the next few days when voters go to the polls.
Thanks, Liz.
To election matters now, and as the party leaders embarked on the critical last few days before Thursday's vote, Boris Johnson's campaign was tonight rocked by a new controversy over the state of the NHS. It began with a newspaper photo showing a 4-year-old boy who had been forced to sleep on the floor of an overcrowded hospital, which Jeremy Corbyn called a disgrace to our society. Then, in an extraordinary sequence of events, the Prime Minister pocketed the phone of an ITV News reporter who was trying to show him the picture before agreeing to look at it and apologising for what it showed.
The picture that broke hearts and triggered one of the more important disputes of this election. A 4-year-old boy at Leeds General Infirmary struggling to breathe with suspected pneumonia, left on the floor of A&E for hours. And Joe Pike, an ITV reporter, assumed the Prime Minister would want to say sorry.
How do you feel looking at that photo?
Of course. And let me tell you that I haven't had a chance to look at it.
Why don't you look at it now, Prime Minister? You refuse to look at the photo. You've taken my phone, put it in your pocket, Prime Minister. His mother says the NHS is in crisis. What's your response to that?
I'm sorry. It's a terrible, terrible photo, and I apologise, obviously, to the families and all those who have terrible experiences in the NHS.
And later, in Sunderland at a rally, Boris Johnson insisted he had a plan to deliver enough beds in Leeds's and other hospitals.
I'm very proud of what we are doing to rebuild Leeds General Infirmary. What I don't want to see is a fantastic programme that is going to unite and level up our country being blocked again. And we've got a bill in Parliament that would insist that we have to increase funding on the NHS over and above inflation every year.
Labour's leader in Bristol, not impressed.
A 4-year-old boy suffering from pneumonia being treated on the floor of a hospital.
That is a disgrace. We need to invest in our public services and end austerity. We simply have to invest in our NHS, and 40,000 nurse vacancies are just one of the many problems the NHS faces. It needs the resources a Labour government will put into it.
And guess what? The Liberal Democrat leader also knew who to blame.
It's a really strong and powerful example of how the NHS is being starved of the resources that it needs.
And if there was any doubt that this was a crisis for the Tory campaign, that was dispelled when the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, made an emergency visit to the hospital in Leeds.
But it's just about the amount of resources and things that we can actually put in.
As a father of 3 small children, who myself have spent long evenings in A&E, I know how it feels, and I feel terrible for anybody who has to go through that.
Do you apologise to the
yes,
family?
of course, and to anybody who gets service from the NHS that isn't up to the standard that they should expect.
And then, to round off an emotional day for both big parties, a few protesters sent Hancock home with a flea in his ear.
You are not welcome in this brown hospital!
And one of Hancock's aides was poked in the face, but despite what many of us were told by the Tories, it was plainly an accident. The contenders, the one on the left had the best of the last few hours, and whether he's catching up with the one on the right, we'll know in just over 3 days. Robert Peston, News at 10.
Well, our political correspondents have been reporting for us as they've accompanied all the major parties up and down the country throughout the campaign. And they join us now at the start of the final few days before you get to vote. Let's join Libby Wiener first, who's been with the Labour leader. Libby, I suppose you could say, as Robert was just saying there, a good day for Corbyn?
Yes, well, when I spoke to Jeremy Corbyn earlier, he said that Labour would win on Thursday. I think that does put him firmly in the camp of wild optimists. But after the last 24 hours, it doesn't seem quite so fanciful. The fact is the Labour leader has had quite a good day on the stump, drawing large crowds despite the very bitter cold winter weather. Much bigger crowds than we've seen at any stage, I'd say, in this campaign. There is, though, a theory that it isn't oppositions that win elections, rather that governments lose them. And I think the significance of today is that the performance of the NHS, or some would say the underperformance in some areas, is now centre stage, and Labour believe that they can capitalise on that. Boris Johnson, up till now, has been trying to blame his predecessors for the problems in the NHS, but I think today's blunder was all his own.
All right, Libby, thanks very much indeed. Well, Paul Brand is following the Conservative campaign. And Paul, an attempt by the Tories to move on to another subject this afternoon, unsurprisingly.
Yeah, Raggy, tonight one slip-up that the Prime Minister isn't trying to correct. This afternoon, Boris Johnson effectively blurted out a new policy in response to a question from a worker in Sunderland, arguing that the BBC licence fee is no longer fit for purpose. He said you have to question whether it makes sense. And on the plane flying down here to the southwest this evening, he elaborated further, saying that other media organisations have to compete on the basis of other funding models. I understand what Number 10 is looking at here, potentially, is stopping prosecuting people who don't pay the licence fee. They argue that is clogging up the courts with thousands of cases. So essentially what we're looking at here, potentially, is a voluntary subscription service for the BBC, a bit like Netflix or Amazon Prime. Tonight the BBC has hit back at that, saying that the licence fee is popular among the public as the best funding model. But this evening, this is one controversy the Prime Minister is keen to court.
That's interesting. Thanks, Paul. And now to Rachel Younger, who's in Bath. And Rachel, bring us up to date with what the Lib Dems have been up to, because it seems they've got a little bit of catching up to do, don't they?
Yeah, they do, and I think, frankly, that is beginning to show. Jo Swinson's been doing the rounds of the radio and television studios today, and there is, I think it's fair to say, a note almost of desperation beginning to set in, and certainly some significant backpedalling. Right at the heart of the Lib Dem manifesto has been this promise to revoke Article 50, essentially simply to cancel Brexit overnight without a second referendum. Now, that hasn't gone down with voters anything like as well as Jo Swinson had hoped, and what we've been hearing from her today has been a very different message. She's replacing it by saying that instead she will simply push as hard as she can for a second people's vote. Now, it's interesting, isn't it? Because there is a degree of logic in her argument, saying that without a majority, and she knows she can't get that, she wouldn't have a democratic mandate to stick to her original policy. But I think it does also offer ammunition to her critics, who say this campaign never really got off the ground because she overpromised so much at the start and is now in real danger of significantly under-delivering with just 3 days to change that.
Indeed. Rachel Younger in Bath, thanks very much. Well, on to Emma Murphy, who's with the Brexit Party tonight. Emma, what kind of final push are we expecting from the Brexit Party, who promised so much?
Well, it's certainly going to be a final push of vim and vigour if today was anything to go by. Nigel Farage was out on the doorsteps, knocking on doors, particularly here in Barnsley, where a lot of homeowners were flooded over the previous weeks. He was getting a very warm reception. And this is one of those areas that they do have high hopes for. There are 2 seats potentially up for grabs for the Brexit Party here. Today, Nigel Farage said that he believed that they could win Barnsley Central and Barnsley East. The polls are not saying that that is the case, but polls have been wrong before. This is a new party, it's a young party, and it is an unpredictable election. So perhaps he is correct in his belief that he will win seats here. It will be down to the voters to make that decision and whether or not he managed to engage with them enough in his door knocking today.
OK, Emma, thanks very much indeed.
The Prime Minister knows the power of a compelling photo. He's stood next to Father Christmas and a mound of Turkish delight. He's posed with a kipper and with a brick. He's clutched chickens and tethered bulls. And there was that complicated business with the scone. But there's one photo he'd prefer you not to see, a picture he himself resisted. And it's one that may come to define these last few days. In one of the more bizarre exchanges of the campaign, Prime Minister was shown the image of a 4-year-old boy suffering suspected pneumonia, wrapped up in a coat on a Leeds hospital floor during an 8-hour wait at A&E after it was published in the Mirror and circulated widely online. He refused to look at it and ended up pocketing the journalist's phone. This afternoon, an attempt at damage limitation. Health Secretary Matt Hancock was dispatched to Leeds to make amends. It didn't go according to plan. Tonight, as the race to number 10 enters its final few days, we ask if the NHS could eclipse Brexit as the driving decider of this election. Here's Nick Watt.
Thanks, Emily. Well, an uncomfortable day for Boris Johnson after the Daily Mirror featured on its front page that story about 4-year-old Jack. Now, as you are saying, the Prime Minister ran into trouble when he initially refused to look at Jack's photo on the phone of Joe Pike, correspondent from ITV News Calendar.
I'm talking about this boy, Prime Minister. How do you feel looking at that photo?
Of course. And let me tell you that I haven't had a chance to look.
Why don't look at it now, Prime Minister? Look at it now. You refuse to look at the photo. You've taken my phone, put it in your pocket, Prime Minister. His mother says the NHS is in crisis. What's your response to that?
I'm sorry. It's a terrible, terrible photo, and I apologise, obviously, to the families and all those who have terrible experiences in the NHS.
So an eventual apology there, but questions about whether the Prime Minister is so wedded to trotting out his Get Brexit Done message that sometimes he struggles to see the time when some human empathy would be called for. Now, Jeremy Corbyn, well, he was quick to seize on this.
People ask questions about this, and I simply say this. The Tories have had 9 years to fund our NHS properly. It's time to bring their regime to an end.
Well, the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, he was quickly dispatched to Leeds General Infirmary, where he issued an apology to the family, and he also pointed out that that will be one of 6 hospitals due for a rebuild.
To tell you the truth, I was horrified. You know, I've got 3 small children myself. I've spent too many evenings in A&E, and I know what it feels like, and I want to make it better.
Now, as the Health Secretary left, he was loudly heckled. Conservative sources said that he was punched by a protester. That a special advisor was punched by a protester. More like walking inadvertently into the gesticulating arm of that protester.
Shame on you! 10 years of underfunding this system! We do not want you in this city! We do not want you in this country! These people have devastated our country!
And some good news. Jack is back home. Emily.
Nick, thanks very much indeed. Well, the Conservatives were offered a chance to come on to Newsnight and discuss this. They declined. Joining us now from Labour's front bench, Barry Gardiner. Do you believe, Barry, that an image like the one we've just seen of the child on the hospital floor, do you believe that that and the story behind it can actually shift election results?
Look, I think images are extraordinarily powerful. And you remember that dreadful image of the young boy on the seashore, the refugees that conscientise people, Iron Cody. But I think they are most powerful when they seem to resonate people's experience. And I think that's what we find with an image such as this, because people's experience of the NHS is that it has got remarkably worse.
Even when you saw Matt Hancock right there on the scene, he apologised. The Prime Minister himself said a terrible photo.
Well, the Prime Minister, first of all, of course, put the phone in his, took it off the report and put it in his pocket. And isn't that symptomatic of the way in which this Prime Minister tends to deal with things that he doesn't like? He simply wants to avoid the issue and move on. And I think what people have seen here in today's events as they've unfolded is an echo of their experience, that they're having to wait 18 weeks for their operations and then having them cancelled at the last minute. They have relatives who are waiting for hour after hour on trolleys. They see that the health service has 43,000 nurses short, 100,000 vacancies.
So if this is about echoes of experiences, if this photo summed up a day-to-day reality of the pressure that the NHS is under, why do you think it has fallen to a newspaper and a mother and her son to make the country sit up? I mean, this is your job. She has cut through where Labour, the opposition party, hasn't.
Well, look, you know that elections are strange things, and sometimes images just propel an issue into the forefront in a way that doesn't happen in normal times.
But you have made the NHS central to your campaign, and yet how many times has Jeremy Corbyn visited a hospital since the campaign?
I don't know. But
began?
Look,
it's a serious question, though, isn't it?
Because it is central to the campaign. But of course, the reason that we have kept focus on it, laser-like focus on it, is because it is clearly something that does have traction with people. They are deeply concerned about this.
But you say laser-like, Barry. We haven't been able to find, we have struggled to find more than one trip that Jeremy Corbyn made to a hospital since September. Boris Johnson has been to 10. Does that sound about right?
I have no idea.
I'm serious.
Yeah,
I mean, you know, I've got lists of all the ones that he's been to. That he has been to 10 during the course of September.
It shows he's on the back foot, doesn't it?
No, it shows that Jeremy Corbyn has not actually campaigned on the one issue that he said was central to the very heart of the campaign. When we think of Jeremy Corbyn talking about the NHS, we think of him standing on a podium with a dossier.
But look, there are different elements of what is happening in our NHS. And you look at the revelation today of the board minutes from all the non-specialist acute trusts around the country. What they were talking about in terms of catastrophic and extreme risks. You know, the collapse of a roof.
The emotional power of a photo, and now you're talking to me about board minutes. And when I look at Mr Johnson's trip to Whipps Cross Hospital, to Princess Alexandra, to North Manchester, to Watford, to Milton Keynes, to Edinburgh, blah, 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 Bassett Lord General, West Cromfield, Leeds General. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn didn't even go to Leeds today. He's been once. He's been to Crawley Hospital, and that was actually before the election was called. I just wonder why he wouldn't understand. If you were so confident about Labour's strength on this issue, why aren't you doing the reminding of people of 10 years in power? There were legitimate
Emily,
things to go on here.
Look, I don't buy the fact that we have not put the NHS foursquare at the centre of our campaign. We have.
You told us about a hypothetical, which is
no.
About a trade deal with America.
Please don't say it's hypothetical.
That was what we've heard, isn't it?
No. Look, there are many aspects of what we've talked about in this campaign. We've talked about the 4.4 million people who are waiting longer than 18 weeks. We've talked about the 17,000 beds that have been cut. And that's why you have people waiting on trolleys, and why you have an image like today of that little boy having to be on coats on the floor.
Barry, tell me your core message, because you know what the Tory message is on Brexit, and Tory voters can repeat it. Can voters repeat your message?
Yes, I believe they can.
What?
Save the NHS.
It's not save the NHS, is it? You've been saying they chant not for sale.
What we are trying to impress on people is that they need, in their vote on Thursday, to save our NHS from all the ways in which this government is seeking to undermine it. So the doubling
So you think if you asked a voter what the core message that they've heard from Labour, it would be save the NHS? Because that hasn't been our experience.
Well, what's your experience, Emily?
Well, our experience is that when we go to places like Bolsover, when we go to the famous Red Wall, people who would never consider themselves Conservative, who would never in a million years dream of calling themselves a Tory, are or have, by postal vote, voted Tory for the first time.
You didn't answer the question. I mean, normally that's your line to me. But my question to you was, what then do they say our core message is? I believe that if you go out there...
They don't know. That's what I'm saying. If you've been able to say 10 years of austerity and Conservative rule in places like Bolsover, in places right across West Yorkshire, Rotherham, Sheffield, if that had landed, why would these people have been saying, actually, this time we'll vote Tory?
Well, look, we have a very unusual election, as you know, because Brexit cuts across the normal electoral issues of the day. And it certainly has in this election. That's taken for granted.
Conservatives are crossing those party lines. They are cutting across those party lines.
No, Brexit does that. It's not the Conservatives that do that. Sorry. What the Conservatives have done is they've taken one extreme position within the Brexit debate. What we've done is we've tried to say that actually, in order to reunite the country and heal the divisions, not just in our society but in families, we need to try and bring people back together. But that's not just about Brexit, it is also about public services. It's about the NHS and making sure that we protect the NHS.
Is an absolutely key word here, isn't it? And groups like Momentum, some of Mr Corbyn's most fervent supporters, have been very critical over the years, not just now, but over the last few years, of other branches of the Labour Party, narrowing your base, deselecting this ideologically pure sense of what being Labour is.
Emily, this is ridiculous. He threw 21 people out of the Conservative Party, Ken Clarke, David Gauke. I mean, you could not get more one-nation Conservatives. This is not a one-nation Conservative Party.
You have got Corbyn supporters who call Mr Blair, Tony Blair, a Tory. Is it any wonder, if you're calling many people in the middle a Tory, that they end up voting Tory? You accept that you have been ideologically pure in what you've demanded of Labour voters this time around. That's why they've left.
I believe that the Labour Party has to be broad enough to encompass all strands of those who are democratic socialists.
Does Momentum understand that?
Look, Momentum is one small element within the Labour Party. No, I'm sorry. It's one element within the Labour Party, and it's an important element because actually that has given some of the most dynamic force to the campaigning that we've had. We are now the largest political party in Western Europe, over 500,000 members. That's bigger than all the other parties in this country together.
It should be easy for you to win if that is the size of your base. John McDonnell told me last year...
We don't have the billionaires piling money into our coffers to fight the election, though. You will grant that.
Oh, come on. It's one person, one vote. I mean, you're not pretending that being a billionaire gives you more of a vote, are you?
No, what I'm saying, not pretending, what I'm saying is that it actually gives the political party, the Conservative Party, the money to be able to campaign and fight the election through Facebook, through social media, on all the other ways in which they do that.
But it's also about embracing, OK? Because other Labour leaders...
You would not deny that money actually counts in terms of spending on a general election.
If it was always that simple, then the Conservatives would always have bigger donors and they'd always win, and Tony Blair wouldn't have won 3 times, which was, now it looks like it was 4 Conservative elections ago if Boris Johnson wins this on Friday. Now, John McDonnell told me last year that
we better make sure he doesn't then, hadn't we?
Right. Well, this is exactly the key, the core of it, if you like, because when you have somebody like John McDonnell right at the heart of your party saying he cannot be friends with a Tory, and I understand this was said slightly in jest in the feel of it, but what do you say to supporters who say, I'm not a Tory, I've never considered myself a Tory, I would never think of voting Tory, but I am voting for Boris Johnson this time. Are you friends with them? How do you ever get those people back?
Look, I believe that the way we do it is by saying, look at whose policies are going to make the greatest difference, beneficial difference in your life. And whether you're somebody working in the public sector and you're going to get a 5% pay rise from Labour because of all the years of austerity that you've been through. Whether you're a 1950s woman who has suffered the theft, effectively, of your pension at the last minute, you're going to get that reinstated by Labour. We are the party, whether it's in schools or in the hospitals, in our NHS, we are the party that is actually providing the solutions to the 10 years that this government has starved public services in this country, driven down our rail network, made sure that all our infrastructure fails. We want to rebuild that and rebuild the country.
Thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you.